when the secular power policies contradict the doctrine of the Church, and that is the common ground of all such prideful heretics, that professing themselves to be wise, they only come to foolishness and impotent policies of appeasement of evil systems, instead of being obedient to the infallible authority of the true divine institution Roman Catholic Church and to her divinely supplied guidance, which, in the case of such fallacious and disastrous policies of acknowledgment, appeasement and even direct cooperation with the diabolically directed atheistic communist enemies of God, those from Russia, China, and so on, and by forcing such evil policies upon the population of such countries, which claim to be still seemingly guaranteeing freedom of consciences and even religious rights, liberty and sovereignty of the Church, these contradictory public policies are in fact destabilizing that trust and even continual security of the true Catholic Church, and are therefore exposed and directly publicly protested against in this important publication of the genuine Holy See, and the time of divine repayment for such heretical, evil, and anti-Catholic policies of the secular state are presently here, and more serious tragic ones are yet to come. The day of divine wrath and vengeance is coming, for all such apostasy, outright criminal abuse of authority, treason, and direct long-term enabling of the communist subversion of entire countries and subsequent truly diabolical communist atheistic tyranny.
The secular power is by divine ordinance and by divine law subordinated to the overriding authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And since this is not understood thoroughly today or rejected, and that the governments think that they can decide for themselves and they don't possess the light of the guidance, the divine guidance of the Holy Ghost in them, and most of these governments are run by godless people who reject that guidance to begin with, or the faith that needs to be present in the soul to achieve that, to obtain it from our Lord. Then the Holy See has to raise her voice once again in admonition to those who still want to be truly Catholic, and to inform them about the situation that's about to happen, because the outcome of these evils are only the sort of repayment for that which is happening today in the world. It means disobedience, godlessness, denial of the authority of the Church, outright hostile acts against the Church and her doctrine that is infallible, and rejection of that authority and implementation of self-righteous selfishness and policies, public policies of the state that do not reflect the will of God, or for that matter, which is equally evil and abominable, the doctrine of the Church, the true Catholic Church, of which we are by divine will and selection the Sovereign Pontiff. So today's recording is based on this, and will reflect all the consequences that are present today because of what is neglected by these self-invited policymakers that have totally set aside the authority of the Church, and that the guidance that they should seek from the Church, and they seek none of it, or they reject it, or they recognize non-Catholic apostate sect with communist connections, this Novosodus sect, as if this sect was somehow endowed with that authority, and that's not possible to be ascertained and really even contemplated and acknowledged and so forth. The world today is, and the situation in this world, what it is a reflection of the state of the soul, a state of how this world has progressed over the years. First, the policy of appeasement, which needs to be addressed. Appeasement of tyrants, namely the communist tyrants, and rejection of the sound doctrine and even the necessary doctrine that's reflected in the Holy Scripture. St. Paul speaks about this in one of his epistles, not to have anything to do with unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. What is reproved is made manifest, and so forth. That is part of the revealed faith. And therefore the Holy See has the duty to speak out on those policies, because they reflect on the mindset of those who may be following their evil example. That it is somehow possible to shake hands with those who have blood on their hands and are tyrants. That is not possible. For a state that claims to be acknowledging democracy and liberty of conscience and so forth, and at the same time to have public policy that is that of appeasement and friendship with countries that are known to be communists and have imposed tyrannical way of life and bearable way of life on their citizens, that is not pleasing to God. And the book of Isaiah, it speaks about the laws, wicked laws. That's chapter 10 of Isaiah. And another place, Isaiah speaks, pronounces the greatest woe. Woe to them that put good for evil and evil for good, light for darkness and darkness for light. And that's from God himself, speaking through the mouth of the prophet. How can it be ascertained and acknowledged by these people who were or are in charge of public influence and policies of the government when they disregard this warning from God? What good can they bring? How, if they are neglectful in seeking guidance from the Holy See, from the true Catholic Church, how they expect to bring anything good of themselves? Because God will not help them to produce these things unless they are outright enemies of God and they are pretenders and they call themselves such to cover up their tracks and alignment with that same doctrine they only supposedly or seemingly detest and so forth. We speak about the so-called, what the communists like to call the controlled opposition, and it's not part of this present publication to get into more detail what that is exactly, but those are the kind of people that is, in another terms called, are the useful idiots, or people who are aligned in some way with the doctrine of communism but are not prepared yet to be active in the tyrannical part of communist tyranny and so forth, but have no problem in pushing through the public policy and preparing the ground for the communists to take over in a revolutionary, violent manner entire world. Russian communists, Chinese communists, and so forth, to benefit them by public policy of the state, to open the door for them so that they have access to resources and recognition and so forth, to outright enable their own doctrine and strategies to flourish in the Western countries, even including the United States and other seemingly today still democratic countries. None of these countries are led by people who have the light of truth in them, because they do not seek the truth at the source where the truth is safeguarded. That means the true Holy See. That's where the truth is. And they will not obtain it at the hands of the sect that is occupying the Vatican today, or any other members of this horrible sect, because those are servants of the devil with communist connections. Again, we do not need to enlarge on how this sect started, because obviously it was that was part of our previous publications and so forth, so there's no need to go into much detail. But the communist connections of this horrible sect that have stolen the worldwide church property, including the Vatican, and uses it for disseminating the communist propaganda and doctrine and strategy and so forth to actually demoralize the world and discourage people from turning back into the bosom of the church and becoming actually Catholic, which must be based on total rejection of this horrible sect and as such. That outcome was necessary to be established by the communists themselves to prepare the ground for what is seen today. So this recording will enlarge on some of the aspects of this horrendous situation that needs to be explained to those who still may be willing to listen. How many they are, that only belongs to God to know. And at the time of the divine wrath, it will be revealed.
Thina bantu bomkhonto sizimisele ukuwabulala bona lamabhunu. Thina bantu bomkhonto sizimisele ukuwabulala bona lamabhunu. Manta!
Mr. Mandela, can you tell us how you feel visiting this spot at this time?
It is a very emotional moment for us. That those who are fighting for democracy, for peace, for love among South Africans should...
My president.
My brother.
President, my brother.
How are you?
My brother.
Please. Please. Very nice to see you.
Están contentos de verlo.
Please sit down.
Están contentos. Por favor, venga bien
Please sit down.
sentarse.
Please sit down.
Siéntese.
Now, one thing before we say anything.
Una cosa antes de hablar, nada.
Before we say anything,
Antes de hablar absolutamente de cualquier tema,
you must tell me when you are coming to South
me
Africa.
tiene que decir cuándo viene para Sudáfrica.
You see, no, just a moment.
No, un momentito.
Es seguro, si ya yo recibí.
The sooner the better.
And we have had a visit from a wide
Y nos ha
variety of
visitado una
people.
gran cantidad de personas.
And our friend Cuba,
Y nuestro amigo Cuba,
which helped us in training our people,
que nos ayudó a entrenar a nuestra gente,
gave us resources to
que nos
get
dio
on with our
recursos,
struggle,
que nos ayudaron tanto en nuestra
trained
lucha.
our people. You have not come to our country.
Cuba no ha venido a visitarnos, usted no ha ido a visitar.
When are you coming?
¿Cuándo viene?
You have seen him through the eyes of the media and other sources of information. But here in thank you.
It's never the plan, and not easy to tarnish the reputation of an international hero, a Nobel Peace Prize winner. The world embraces and recognizes the father of a nation, as opposed to the reality, the spear of a nation. The world knows Nelson Mandela for his struggle and long walk to freedom, but what the world doesn't know is that it was, is, and always will be a lie. It is the world's greatest con and the long walk of a terrorist. There is no rainbow nation, and there never was. The hero who purportedly led South Africa to freedom, yet the same man who in 1992, 2 years after his release and surrounded by members of the ANC and the ANC's terrorist arm, the Umkhonto we Sizwe, sang their song reaffirming their promise to kill them, kill the whites, as he clenched his fist in an aggressive
Communist
salute. The same hero whose evils were justified by the world due to the reputed struggles of apartheid, irrespective of his close alliances with communist and terrorist regimes such as Castro, cheering the words, "Long live Comrade Fidel Castro," referring to Gaddafi as "my brother leader," and pointing to Arafat as a comrade in arms. When someone from outside the borders of South Africa says, "We didn't know," or Nelson Mandela, a true hero, I, and so many South Africans, are once again painfully aware of the certainty that there are screens in place, filtering out the true state of the atrociousness taking place against farmers and the minority population in South Africa. Again, put into motion by Nelson Mandela, once aided by Cyril Ramaphosa. The world might be able to ignore the gruesomeness and tortures applied to victims by not reporting the true facts in mainstream media.
Under Mandela, the murderers who attacked churches like this, St. James Church, this is the St. James Massacre. In 1993, 5 terrorists of the Pan-African Congress burst in, murdered these people through hand grenades. Nelson Mandela admitted he gave the order to open fire on these demonstrators, these Inkatha Freedom Party.
The now novice ordo sectarian, which means non-Catholic heretic, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives Newt Gingrich, here attempting to defend the communist terrorist and true criminal, member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of South Africa and also one of the founding members of the ANC communist terror faction Umkhonto we Sizwe, Nelson Mandela. Gingrich is fully aware of the horrendous terrorist bombing and murder atrocities of Mandela's Communist Red Terror, and of his very warm friendship with the Cuban communist terrorist Fidel Castro, KGB agent PLO terrorist Yasser Arafat and another socialist and KGB asset Muammar Gaddafi. How bad can the US policy really get with people like this? Reportedly Mandela was responsible for plotting over 150 terrorist attacks, using Russian and Chinese supplied bombs and landmines, and reportedly ordering such crimes to be committed even while already serving his later commuted life prison sentence. There is no other explanation but that Gingrich is purposely deceiving.
So I wrote my newsletter at Gingrich Productions on Friday. Basically, I entitled it, "What Would You Have Done?" And everybody says they love freedom. Everybody who is proud of the farmers at Lexington and Concord who stood up to the British Army. Everybody who is grateful to George Washington for 8 years in the field fighting the British Empire. Here you are, you emerge as a young man. He actually went to a Methodist school, and Mandela went on to be largely a non-violent person.
A lawyer.
A lawyer, tried in court, very effectively used his role as defendant, and he was one of the people who was opposed to it. Now, ironically, most of the things people complain about occurred during the 27 years he was in prison. And so I
the
tried.
necklacing comes up a lot.
All of that stuff occurs while he's in jail. Now, the 2 points I make to people about Mandela personally are, first of all, this very long, deep commitment to freedom, which I think most of us could identify with. And second, that after 27 years in prison, he doesn't come out bitter. He doesn't come out angry. He comes out as an extraordinarily wise man who actually invites his prison guard to sit in the front row at his inauguration as president. Look, I think there are some people who bought a rationale that defined everybody who was in any way in rebellion against the established system in the third world as anti-American, which I in fact don't think they were. I think that we, in many cases, we were the symbol of what they wanted. We were the kind of country they wanted to become. But I do think there are people who have sustained this kind of mythology, and there's no question that in the 50s, Mandela moved from a non-violent model towards being allied with the communists. And my point to conservatives is there weren't any conservative allies. I mean, Churchill allied with Stalin during World War II. And I think in a similar tradition, Mandela was desperate by that stage. He saw the scale of the oppression. And the only allies that were available, frankly, were on the hard left.
Now I'd like to introduce my boss, the representative of the 6th District of Georgia, the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich.
President Clinton,
President Mandela, Mrs. Michelle, honored guests. As I sat here looking out over this marvelous room, thinking of what a miracle this meeting is, and how impossible it would have been to predict this possibility 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, I think we should take just a moment to honor the member of this Congress who I think without question did the most day in and day out, year in and year out, to maintain the fight to end apartheid, our friend, our former colleague, Ron Dellums, who is here with us today. This is a remarkable country, often slow, often obtuse, and yet it provides opportunity for those with courage to make an enormous difference over time. This room, the Rotunda, in many ways is the symbol of democracy and freedom. Across the way is a replica of the Magna Carta, the great charter signed 783 years ago, which began the process of returning power to the people and taking power away from kings and governments. In this room, you will find statues of George Washington, who lived a life of such dedication and such discipline that he literally became the father of his country, of Abraham Lincoln, who led a great civil war, the bloodiest single conflict in American history, to end slavery and reaffirm the Union, and who brought the Declaration of Independence, with its commitment that we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, to the center of our political process. You will note the statue of the suffragettes, who fought and worked to extend those liberties to women, and to assert that all meant all, not just half, and who waged a lifetime of campaigning to set the stage for modern freedoms. You will note the statue, the bust of Martin Luther King Jr., who died in the cause of truly extending Lincoln's freedom so that it became real and not merely symbolic, and so that all Americans truly had an opportunity to participate in the rights God had given them. All of these are in this great room. And yet, if you look around at the 8 large portraits, you will note that in 3 of them, George Washington is present, almost half. And the reason is that there are rare moments in a country's history when it is defined by a personality, when it resonates and changes in a way that for generations are imprinted on child after child, in speech after speech, and lesson after lesson. For those who knew Washington, he was literally indescribable. His being, his will, became the heart of America. We are privileged today to be in the presence of the father of multiracial democracy in Africa, and the leading example in the world today of the spirit of Washington and King. Politics in a free society is a very rough and tumble business, involving at times great personal pain. And yet I would say to all of my colleagues who are here today, when you contemplate 27 years in prison, when you imagine walking out of that isolation with your heart larger and not smaller? I think, President Mandela, you give every person on the planet a personal witness to how valuable freedom must be to be worthy of such a life. Thank you.
Now it's my distinct and great honor to introduce our boss, the President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton.
Ses mense is dood en 5 ernstig beseer in nog 'n landmynontploffing in Noord-Transvaal. Die minister van Verdediging, generaal Magnus Malan, het die gebied vandag besoek.
Die landmyn is laat gistermiddag hier op die wildplaas Amersham van meneer Koos de Nuysen afgetrap, toe hy en sy gesin en die Van Eck gesin van Sanien hier op die plaas gery het om na wild te kyk.
Ons het die landmyn met 'n bakkie afgetrap, sy regter agterwiele die landmyn getref. Die voertuig is deur die lug geslinger en het 'n einde af op die grond geval, waarna ons in vlamme gehul was. Toe ek by myself kom, het ek gemerk dat my baba seentjie van 18 maande, wat op my skoot gesit het, dat hy nog leef, en hy het vir my gekyk. Dit het vir my gelyk of hy niks bekeer nie. Die voertuig was in vlamme gehul. Ek het gesien dat meneer de Nuysen, wat die voertuig bestuur het, op die stuurwiel lê en sy hare was aan die brand en daar erg bloed by sy voorkop uitgespuit. Ek het probeer uit die voertuig uitklim, maar as gevolg van die impak van hierdie slag, was ek nie in staat om dit te doen nie. Ek het die deur probeer oopskop, en ek kon ook nie daarin slaag. Ek het besef dat ons gaan doodbrand binne in hierdie voertuig, want ons het net voor die aanvang van ons rit, het ons die voertuig vol brandstof gemaak. Ek het toe deur die venster geklim en my seentjie saam met my gevat en hom aan die pad neergesit langs haar. Ek het reg agter die voertuig, omtrent 5 meter daarvandaan, het ek my vrou en mevrou Marie de Nuysen aangetref, erg vermink en op slag dood. Hierna het ek verder begin rondsoek, en na geruime tydjie het ek op my dogtertjie en haar vriendinnetjie afgekom, waar hulle dood lê. Net hierna het ek op klein Kobus de Nuysen afgekom, wat nog lewe in hom gehad het. Ek het teruggegaan na sy pa toe, en vir hom dit gesê dat die kind lewe nog, maar dat hy erg vermink is en verbrand was. Hy, meneer de Nuysen, het daar op die toneel gevra dat die kind maar moet gaan, wat ook toe gebeur het. Verder het ek begin soek na my seentjie van 3 jaar oud, maar ek kon hom nie vind nie. Tot vandag toe kon ek hom nie vind nie. Dis vandag 10 jaar later. Nou is my vraag net dit. Wat gaan u doen? Wat gaan die ANC hieraan doen? Gaan ons hierdie wandaad maar net miskyk en dit maar laat lê?
Good evening. 2 of the 4 people injured in 2 separate landmine blasts in the eastern Transvaal yesterday are in a critical condition in the Rob Ferreira Hospital in Nelspruit. The latest blast near Nelspruit came just hours after terrorists launched an attack on a sewerage works near the town. Cameron, Rob Minna and Chris Alkers visited the scene of the blast today.
The first landmine was detonated on a farm road approximately 9 kilometers from Nelspruit. A vehicle with 7 occupants detonated the landmine at approximately 5:20 yesterday afternoon. 5 people died here, including 2 babies, only 9 and 10 months old. The powerful blast of the Russian-made landmine ripped the vehicle apart. The owner of the farm, Mr. Philip Raat, and several other neighbors who heard the explosion rushed to the scene. They found 2 seriously injured men in the front seats. One woman was flung 60 meters through the air, and part of her clothing could still be seen today hanging in shreds from the top of the tree. Under her body, police found the mutilated body of a small baby. It was only later, when they removed a blanket from what they believed to have been a doll, that the body of the second baby was found. The injured were rushed to Rob Ferreira Hospital, where they are in a satisfactory condition. While police were still busy sifting through the debris, at 8:20 last night, the Roos family were on their way back home to their farm Stellenrust, 15 kilometers from Nelspruit. The family had been to church and were traveling in 2 vehicles. 32-year-old Mrs. Mariki Roos, her 9-year-old son Jaco, 5-year-old Corrie, and her 18-month-old baby brother Johan were in the vehicle that detonated the mine only 300 meters from their home.
Ek wat agter hulle gery het plus minus 20 meter, het die volle gebeure gesien. Ek het gesien hoe die vlamme onder die kar uitborrel. Ek het gesien hoe die kar in die lug optrek. Uit die pad uit, in die linkerkant 90 grade weg, in die bos. Stukke metaal, stof, grond, het deur die lug getrek. Ek het nader gery gestop, uitgespring, en ek het gesê, Here, waarom? Ek het nader gegaan. Ek het gekyk na my vrou, sy het gesit op haar sitplek, vergrys. Gedeeltes van haar voete was daar nie meer nie. Haar liggaam was bebloed, vol snye. Sy het gekerm en gevra, waar's my bene? Hoekom het ek seer? My seentjie wat agter haar gestaan het, op daardie oomblik het gesit agter op die sitplek, met sy kop skeef en hy was bewusteloos. Wat ons gevind het, is 'n gedeelte van my seun se voorkop, waar hy 'n gat ingehad het, linksbo, van sy harsings, het saam op die sitplek gelê. Ek het dit opgetel, in 'n tissue gesit, dit toegevou, en dit in my huis gaan begrawe. Weet u hoe dit voel, meneer voorsitter? Kan u indink hoe dit voel om jou eie kind van 8-jarige ouderdom, om so van sy breinweefsel en breinskedel op te tel en te gaan begrawe saam met jou pa? Kan u indink wat dit aan 'n mens doen? Hoe moet jy weer 'n mens wees na so 'n ervaring? 3 dae na die landmynontploffing is my vrou dood. Dit het nie goed beter gegaan met Jaco nie. Jaco is op 5 Maart 1987 is Jaco oorlede. Daardie kind het 7 maande van hel en lyding gehad. Daardie kind het as normale kind het hy 35 kg geweeg. By sy afsterwe het hy 15 kg geweeg.
Mandela himself, I think you caught the exact right word. He's a very complex person with a very long life, And I think he's the most important figure in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 100 years. He offers a hope for reconciliation and a hope for moving forward with free enterprise and private property and an opportunity to create jobs and to live together that is greater than any other African leader of the last 100 years. And I think that part of his memory has to be preserved and built upon.
In light of what has been recorded already, and some of it had to be done, South Africa is a prime example of the failure of US policy and the involvement of these people who have no shame but to defend what is completely indefensible. When a person is a communist, an atheist, the danger to the well-being of the common good of the society and so forth, moreover the danger of the continuation of the Roman Catholic Church, of which this horrendous person Gingrich is claiming to be a member. He's not a member because he's excommunicated heretic, part of non-Catholic sect, praising people who are outright enemies of the church, who are responsible for these evils like Ratzinger and so forth. So the church has to raise her voice, because not only that the church condemns all acts of violence and revolutionary tactics and so forth, be it they're communist or whatever else, but that these people are actually connected with the mortal enemies of the church, Russian communists, Chinese communists and so forth, as has been demonstrated in the part that is. To have ties with known KGB agent, Egyptian, not Palestinian, but Egyptian Yasser Arafat, to be tied with communist criminal and terrorist Fidel Castro, to openly praise Fidel Castro and so forth, and to be involved in bombings and using Russian and Chinese supplied ammunition and landmines and so forth, to be openly involved in propagation of murders and horrifying things. And then you have this person who claims to be Catholic, he's excommunicated, to claim these kind of outrageous things. That's not coincidence. To grant Congressional Medal of Honor to the person who was offered to be released from prison, where he was rightfully sentenced, and very leniently, because we're talking about murder and complete destruction of property and so forth, which even in the United States at that time, it was 1962, we speak about Mandela, 1962, or in England he would have been hanged for murder and terror and so forth, and in the US he would be probably electrocuted on electric chair. So what this is horrendous disservice, but we are not surprised at all. This is consequence of failure of policy and appeasement to the communists. This Gingrich had the audacity to claim the involvement of Churchill with Stalin. Well, that's not exactly something that the UK should be proud of, because on the conference at the Alta basically gave a whole of Eastern Europe to communism. That was the greatest betrayal of those Catholic countries that were all of a sudden left to the tyranny of Stalin. And Churchill was guilty of it alongside Roosevelt. So this is the history. So that's not something that the country like United States and UK should be proud of. That's a horrifying scandal, and truly something that God is repaying right now with the situations that are available to be observed. That's the consequence. But we are not surprised. This is the forerunners of the Antichrist. This is people who are willingly lying, publicly lying, causing horrendous scandal, and think that they will get away with it. But this Holy See, responsible for the truth, is publishing this. The apartheid was not something that the Catholic Church would allow or something. No, because Catholic Church would insist on people who are in the country that is Catholic, the harmony of the faith would lead those souls to what is called charity. That's a supernatural gift of God. Cannot be obtained by man. In that case, there would be no need for these kind of segregations and all this. With the case of Africa, the careful study of the situation is evident that those people were killing each other as tribal rivalry and so forth because they were savages. But that's still not racism or any of that. There were Dutch and English, all Protestants, very few Catholics in South Africa. And in that case, the guidance of the Holy Ghost is not there, and these kind of policies really implemented, and then they cause this kind of difficulty. But on the other hand, the extreme of Mandela and his communist thugs and criminals, it's self-evident that cannot be acknowledged as something that was valuable for South Africa, or Africa for that matter. Because the Russians and Chinese communism, mainly Russians, does Gingrich know that Mandela was really pupil of a person whose name was Joe Slovo, KGB agent, who was sent there from Soviet Union to South Africa to cause this, as Trotsky was sent to Mexico and caused the whole thing. What happened at those times? These are the kind of things that people don't realize that are in place. The church condemns racism, the church condemns apartheid, the church condemns communism as a mortal enemy of all good and complete obstacle to salvation. And that's the necessary part that needs to be addressed.
Russian and Chinese communist strategy for the atheistic communist worldwide revolution, their use of the Taliban and of the many communist agents, sympathizers, and assets in the US, EU, Australian and other governments, KGB, FSB, and GRU active measures, including the pre-war demoralization process of the target population, communist subversion and infiltration of the press, government, military and police and justice system, including major role of the so-called controlled opposition, so that the outcome remains unhampered contribution to the victory of communism. Only the genuine Roman Catholic Church will remain protected and helped by God, as the rest of the world will learn the price of apostasy and unbelief by subjected to this upcoming worldwide communist tyranny, the reign of the Antichrist.
By studying the strategy of world communism, maybe Russian communism, one has to pause and consider the course of history which took place in 1980s and were prepared in the 1970s and so forth by the Russian communists to establish, or even prior to that by the strategy as far as that is, to establish the necessary cover for Soviet and Russian communist operations worldwide, namely the use of Islamic terrorism, which the Russians control, and with the help of the Chinese, to have the necessary cover for their own involvement, and so to establish that hatred and teach the hatred for Israel, for the United States and so forth, and all countries that support the existence of Israel, and to take revenge on them by use of acts of terrorism, violence and so forth. For that matter, the strategic country which is extremely strategic for that purpose is called Afghanistan. By observing the map itself, which a lot of people neglect to do, Afghanistan is in the center between countries that are connected with communism, and so to nurture terrorism in that country was essential for the Russians to do, and then pretend that they had to withdraw and they were somehow beaten by the mountain tribes and monarchy that was there before is preposterous, because we're talking about military machine that was only there to establish the grounds for show you the stranglehold, common stranglehold, to establish the networks, necessary networks, and that involves what is called the Taliban in Afghanistan. not only there's connection dated back to Soviet narcotics involvement and opium trade and shipments of narcotics and heroin, which we truly dislike to speak about these kind of things. But it's necessary to grasp the seriousness of the situation. There was a major case involving intercept of about 200 kilograms of heroin in Rotterdam, Holland, from a seizure basically of that kind of drugs, hard drugs, from a Soviet boat, a Soviet vessel. And by careful search on that case, then the Western European intelligence services uncovered virtually the sinister plan. Was involvement of Italian investigator who uncovered Soviet plan to basically load the Western civilization with drugs as a chemical warfare, and that plan is believed to be continual. What Russians did with the help of the whole Soviet satellites, including Cuba and so forth, they established the South American cartels. They perverted the doctrine of the faith down in those countries that used to be very Catholic. The communists, that's testimony of various defectors from Soviet bloc who had knowledge of that strategy. It's called liberation theology. It's highly heretical, it's Marxist, Leninist to the core, and it truly replaces the Catholic doctrine of the Church. And this was cooked up by the Russians, by the KGB Directorate, tasked with active measures against religion, namely against the Catholic Church. And that's what you have today sitting in Vatican. The offspring of that is the layman impostor to the papacy and member of non-Catholic sect. His name is Mr. Jorge Bergoglio, with ties again to KGB run Kremlin. This is a horrendous aftermath that's taking place, so the narcotics trade with South America, the establishment of the drug cartels who are highly communist connected, and the control and firm grip on those networks by Russian and Chinese communists with the help of the satellites, that was the purpose. So to use Taliban, that's another report, reportedly evident that the production of opium in Afghanistan is the highest level in the world, basically. And so that intercept of that vessel, that Soviet vessel, which was government vessel, which there was no private enterprise allowed in Soviet bloc. It was all run by the government, including these vessels that were highly espionage and military espionage vessels that had the task to and stealing technology and everything else what the bloc was interested in, under orders from the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Soviet Union. So they were actually involved in subversion and all this. So these kind of things were highly organized, had to be approved by the highest levels of the Communist Party. And with their knowledge, the strategy exists, and it was described by the defectors who had the first-hand knowledge of this plan. It was, and it is, chemical warfare against the West. So those kind of drugs that come across the border from south, from Mexico into the United States, they are there by the approval of the Mexican government. It's not corruption, it's truly intentional subordination of the Mexican government. It's highly leftist and with connection to Moscow and so forth, is essential for those shipments to go through. We have indication from the sources and our channels of information that such shipments gets through the checkpoints which are in Mexico without any problem, because the government itself of Mexico protects those shipments with getting through those checkpoints, and without any delay or problem they get to the border and they are dismantled and put on those who are supposed to carry them across the border. So to allow the southern border of the United States to be open is serving the purpose of communist subversion, and also paralleling people inside the United States who may have ties to not only military intelligence and military special operations of the communist orbit, including Russian, most of all, on the order from Russians. But they are highly organized communist operatives that are here in the United States to cause disruption and mayhem and so forth, and organize communist revolution, basically. This is the policy of the state, the United States, after what took place in the last elections, which are highly questionable, and with the results that are taking place now with the audits and so forth. This kind of setup had to be organized very carefully, because there's no way that they could pull it off as far as political party and so forth, to cheat in the elections. That's a mark of highly organized effort, and it's not entrusted in political operatives. This has to be done by highly trained espionage, namely communist espionage agents and so forth, and it's truly professionals who take care of it, which means Russian, Chinese and so forth. And so we're not talking about some 20-year-old interns who handle the email or something like that. That's not how this thing is done. So to enlarge on this, what took place in Afghanistan, it's all part of the main plan to try to cause demoralization of the population, because one such person that sits in the White House is in charge of the policies and controls the military, and the military is ordered to stand by and stand down, basically, in terms of extracting US citizens, or watching really the whole withdrawal and leaving military base, Air Force base in Afghanistan. When we consider the map itself, where Afghanistan is, and the preparation for a worldwide communist revolution, it is essential to understand that there would be a strategic place if the United States military controlled the country and had air base in there, and I was able to use that air base to military retaliation against Russia and China and so forth, and Iran. So Afghanistan had to be returned. Now the question is, who is the ones who control Afghanistan? Is it truly Taliban, or is it Russia and China? And the answer is the latter, obviously. There were meetings of the Taliban in Moscow, and there are pictures of that meeting. Obviously that's sufficient proof that the connection exists, and that was in 2018 and 2019 and so forth. So the Russian government was highly interested in controlling. One thing matters, that the border with Tajikistan, of Afghanistan, between Afghanistan and Tajikistan, those formally, quote unquote, formally Soviet republics are not free countries and independent of Russian decision. That is strategic communist deception. And so that cannot be contemplated that Moscow does not assert some kind of influence there. And it's not only influence, it's firm grip, firm control of those territories. So anything that happens in those so-called independent states is only with the approval of Moscow leadership, which means communists. And so then you have the west side of Afghanistan, which is the border with Iran, and that's territory of long-term communist revolution to begin with, because overthrow of the monarchies, of the Islamic monarchies, replacing the teaching curriculum in the schools with the hatred of Israel and United States, and truly invested. That was the testimony of former chief of Romanian Communist Espionage Service, DIE. His name was Pasepa. He testified that he had personal knowledge of the strategy and so forth in regards to it effective in 1978. Actually the chief of the KGB, his name was Andropov, one of the most sinister criminals, communist criminals in the recent history. And his testimony is of Pasepa is that Andropov Russians were pushing this strategy to infest the Islamic countries with the hatred that was based on fraudulent document. That was actually, the document was is called Protocols of the Elders of Zion. According to this testimony, that was forgery, and it was used by Hitler to justify the attack on the Jewish race by the Nazis. And this was used for the purpose to infest actually the Islamic population with that kind of hatred in schools and so forth. And it's very easy to do when people are separated from God in false religion, and then the firm control, supply of weapon and strategy is just only the logical consequence of their actions, because the use of Islam is the necessary cover for the communist takeover. So when their nuclear bombs explode and countries or the nuclear blackmail is used after that, it will be too late, and the initial attack may happen on the Western countries, and they will only look for retaliation against those Islamic countries, because then will the propaganda communist deception exist that will cover up for the real culprits, and they don't sit in Tehran, although they may be used for that purpose, but they sit in Moscow and Beijing. So to be blind to this strategy, and the strongest part of the communist strategy is truly of the communist worldwide revolution is their strategy, the use of deception, subversion, infiltration, and so forth. The press has to be silenced and infiltrated by communists who are truly committed to the cause, so they are instructed to lie, to deceive, to discredit the sources of truth, to attempt to discredit it, because they will never succeed in discrediting the church, because the church is the pillar of the truth. And this strategy has been used so to withdraw, to try visibly bodge the removal of U.S. forces and the civilians who are now held virtually hostage in Afghanistan by the Biden administration is not coincidental at all. And to paint this person as some kind of cognitive disaster that he's not capable of, that is insufficient, because still the the whole cabinet is responsible for these actions, and when this kind of assertion exists, we have to highly pause and start thinking, well, yes, but this person Biden, he was involved in the policy making for so many years, and nothing good came out of it. Only actually difficulty for the existing order, which means free society, liberty of conscience, and so forth.
Okay, and as much as I'm worried about these loons who break into government, I'm actually more worried about the loons who did get elected. Because, I mean, what do you do about these people? There's 147 Republicans in Congress who still don't concede that Trump lost the election. What do you do about people who are in the government who don't believe in our way of government?
It is so shocking. Not only are they not conceding, Bill, but there's thoughts that there might have been some collusion among members of Congress. Some are refusing to go through magnometers or whatever you call them to check for weapons. They're not wearing masks during the siege. I mean, it's really bizarre, isn't it, when you think about how AWOL so many of these members of Congress have gotten. But I also think some of them are believing the garbage that they are being fed 24/7 on the internet by their constituents, and they bought into this big lie. And the question is, how are we going to really almost deprogram these people who have signed up for the cult of Trump?
There are millions of Americans, almost all white, almost all Republicans, who somehow need to be deprogrammed. It's as if they are members of a cult, the Trumpist cult, and who have to be deprogrammed.
There has to be consequences, and then once you get those consequences, I think then people have to take a second look at their actions, and they have to be much more afraid.
I think a lot of people are going to have to be deprogrammed.
When Biden wins, we'll go through all the Republican voters, and Homeland Security will take the children and we'll put them into re-education camps.
Amen.
These times, which are unique. I mean, Trump is close to him.
Joseph Biden claims to be Catholic. We have to address that point too. And he's not Catholic. He's an excommunicated, apostate, sectarian, member of the non-Catholic, pro-communist, neo-Protestant sect. I mean that, and so profession of Catholic faith is not in him. The same applies for his former Speaker of the House, of the U.S. House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich. His history is even more striking, how he came about to convert into this false non-Catholic religion that uses the name of Catholic to deceive and so forth. They are both excommunicated, special reserved to the Holy See, to this Holy See, to our judgment, and they have to repent of these things which they committed and publicly take all the policies back. Otherwise they will have to pay to God for it eternally. So communist penetration of the US government, it is essential to understand that as it does exist. How high, how widespread it is, well, our Lord says, by their fruits you shall know them. What the communists like to do is to hide their tracks. They have to make it look like it's some kind of natural development or incompetence or accident, but with them there's no accidents. Everything is carefully planned. The strategy is carefully and punctually executed. If there is any mistake or any type of setback, such things are punished severely without any regard of human rights and dignity and decency, which means that people are actually murdered for neglecting fulfilling their obligation to fulfill the communist strategy. That was always the mark of communist operations. So there's no such setbacks possible. When we look at what this Joseph Biden does, the results are that he's enabling the communist strategy to exist, to continue. He just gave the whole country to people who are tied with Russia and China. The question remains, we need to ask, well, how many people from the Taliban are there who actually don't come from Afghanistan? They might be coming from Tajikistan and other Islamic population that comes from Soviet Union. And how many of them speak Russian? Do they need interpreter when they have contacts with Russians? There are reports that the Russian GRU was in fact helping the Taliban to round up, or actually there was bounty offered by the Russians for killing US soldiers and so forth. Such reports were now and then flashing through the news. Of course, Russians, they didn't leave Afghanistan without establishing their whole networks that were still subordinated to Moscow. No, they don't do that. They did it in Eastern Europe. They did it in countries that they sort of left behind after the withdrawal of Russian forces after World War II. But that retreat was only strategic, part of the deception and so forth. Overall, we speak about places like Austria and so forth. It's clear to honest observer and to us by certain knowledge that the advancement of communism has been achieved or realized in many countries in the world, although the communists are waiting for that opportunity, and once those safeguards of their strategy are no longer necessary, the open communist revolution will take place. That's why you have all these difficulties, the Chinese virus, how that will spread, how the various countries are implementing truly policies that are unnecessary to be implemented, forcing people to vaccinate and so forth, the vaccines that were obtained with the use of abortion parts of embryos and so forth, aborted in abortion. Those kind of abominations, disregard of the medication that's functional, and lying about the financing of research of that institute in China that is actually there for military purposes, biological warfare. Whatsoever the communists touch, evil comes out of it for the purpose to destroy, to murder, to establish communist mayhem, tyranny worldwide. When you have people responsible for policies of the government that still claims to be democratic and seemingly protects liberty of conscience, and they are enabling this evil to succeed without being obedient to what the Church commands and teaches. And the Roman Catholic Church, the true Church of Christ our Lord, condemned communism long ago. There are countless writings of the popes, including our predecessor of happy memory, Pius XI, who wrote an entire encyclical on the subject of communism called Divini Redemptoris in late 1930s, outlining the doctrine of the Church about communism, condemning the whole system. And it is atheistic, it is truly evil, and we renew that condemnation. Whomsoever dares to cooperate in the triumph of communism is severed from the chance of salvation, severed from the Church, the true Catholic Church, outside of which there is no salvation. And those who follow these strategies of communism and enable them to exist, even by inaction or apathy or indifference, they will reap only disaster from it. And when such people, as you observe in this recording, are part of the decision-making process or legislative process or judicial process and system of the government, then you know that the time of the communist revolution worldwide, the time of the Antichrist, is very near. When they deceive their own population into believing these fraudulent conclusions as outlined in this recording, to have known communist operatives and possession the entire country, and to turn blind eye and even ship foreign aid to such countries like South Africa, and to grant such people recognition when they have blood on their hands, and murder and terror and so forth. It's astonishing. It is truly horrifying, but God will repay it. And so there's no conversion possible without firm acceptance of the Catholic faith, which is nothing else but Catholic tradition. Those who neglect to do so, they will reap only bitter fruits of punishment and divine wrath. And that should suffice today for this recording.